So today what we're going to, ultimate goal of this talk is going to be to provide you some ideas on how to save time, right? And I think all of us can agree that's something, we definitely want to look at is saving time. And how we're going to do that is looking at different things that other departments have that we can leverage and utilize over on the security side. Last year at the Women in ICS conference, at the first, for the S4 conference, I met my co-author, Anne, and we realized that although we work in cybersecurity now, we have decades worth of experience from engineering, quality, sourcing, and safety departments. And as we were listening to people talk about the challenges they're facing in security, we would look at each other and be like, well, that information's kind of compiled over here that this team grabs, and this information's over here. So we wanted to be able to share that with you guys today. So if we look at what the first step is in almost every security framework or set of security requirements, we're typically asked to look at and identify critical systems and assets. And so in IT security, that's based around the CIA triad, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability. And typically that's our domain controllers, servers, databases, key endpoints, and then a handful of devices that are particular to the business operations. But as we start talking about OT security, what happens is safety comes to the forefront of that, and then we start having that category of devices that were critical to the business purpose. That grows greatly, right? It becomes more complex and involves more teams. So as we look at and see what the different teams have available to us that we can leverage upon, then we can save time and also identify, what is critical, because to understand what's critical in OT is to, understand the process, the environment, where we can put typical cybersecurity controls, and in reality where we can't, right? So making sure we understand. So the first tool I'm going to talk about is typically owned by the engineering team. It's a risk priority tool. And it's been around since the 1940s. It's one of those oldie but goodies. And so that one is typically owned by the engineering team. It's called the FMEA, or Failure Modes and Effects Analysis. So what this is a tool that the team will go through, and they'll typically identify failure modes and look at, okay, how can these failure modes fail? What impact does that have to the organization? What is the probability of that occurring? And then how can we detect that? So they use those factors to come up with the risk priority number, or RPN number. Although some industries lately are calling that, and relabeling, as industries and companies like to do, action numbers. So they'll do that, and they'll create a priority list of risk. But where the true value of this comes in is that it's created by a collaborative team of subject matter experts. So. Yeah, that team, no, okay. And so these subject matter experts are most likely the people you're waiting, for an email back from, or you're, trying to get to be involved in your event, or, if you're doing like a CCE event, trying to get them engaged in that as well. So they have already come together, and these are painful to create, the FMEAs, right? But once they're created, they're very effective. So hopefully that team has been bribed, by lots of great meals and unlimited caffeine and, snacks. But what they do is they'll typically, if it's a process FMEA, they'll start with listing out all the steps of the process. There's also product FMEAs where you'll start with the bill of materials with the components and subassemblies, and then functional FMEAs as well. So they look at those and they say, okay, how can this fail? And then they'll say, how else can it fail, right? So they'll go through and do that. But then they also list the consequences of that failure mode. And that's something that's valuable to us, right? Because if that particular item has something that has connectivity and stuff, if we can see what the consequences are, if we were to, say, create that failure by stopping a process on the device, or quarantining, a file on it, or, isolating the device, we'll be able to see what that affected that failure in action would be as well. But they rank that with a severity score. And then they go through and say, okay, what are the possible causes that would have created that failure? And they'll list all those out, and then they go back and rank and say, well, what's the probability that cause, that would actually occur? And then they go through and they say, how can we detect this? Like, what processes do we have control? What procedures? What do we have alarm set that would let us know that this failure has occurred before we realize the impact of the failure? So they do that, and they calculate what is, again, the risk priority number. And that is all great information in itself, right? Like, to have that, we can look upon that and see the impacts that we have. We can start asking the teams to look at in those causes, because right now they're most probably looking at what I'd consider the children of product liability, misuse, mistakes, acts of convenience, but not really the intentional piece, right? So maybe intention in the effect of employee sabotage or competitor sabotage. So being able to ask the teams to start adding those in as they update or create new FMEAs, will help one buy-in, right? So as you're adding in and you're saying, okay, what if the cause of this failure mode was ransomware, which is the one we're all really concerned about, right? So how does that change that? And then that will move that risk up in that priority list. So the team doesn't stop here, though, right? They create the priority list, and then they go through, and if there is a threshold that they've set based on their risk appetite of we want to hit anything that's above this threshold, they'll go through and they'll put mitigation plans in place for that, and then put any actions, make actions to that, and then re-rank all the different scorings. So as you can imagine, if you're adding ransomware into that, the occurrence of that will be high, right? The severity will be high, detection probably pretty high, so that's going to put that higher up on their risk. So whereas you're trying to maybe struggle with them to see the impact, that kind of helps get that buy-in as well. As we're going through and with the FMEAs, how else can security teams use this? They can use it to understand the process, the mitigations, and the risk, and what the teams that are currently supporting it are struggling with, and what they already have in place. You can use it to build out your risk assessment. So this tool typically meets the requirements of any standards that ask for a risk assessment tool. So you can use this and build upon it, as opposed to handing the team a blank slate and saying, please create this, paint a new portrait. You're asking them to fill in the blanks. And then, again, building out playbooks, understanding what the consequences is as you start having them add in the cybersecurity aspects into the FMEAs helps you kind of build out those IR playbooks. And then just providing context, right? You have your asset list, your IPs, your host names, how does this fit into the process, and understanding that piece as well. And again, the biggest, I think, impact it has is building that relationship with those teams. So you're recognizing the work they've already done and building upon that, as opposed to ask them to start from scratch. And I think I see a couple engineers in the audience who are kind of smiling and shaking their heads on that. So I've kind of talked about FMEAs. I personally think they're gold, as at value. But what if, you ask and they don't have an FMEA? So some alternatives that you can ask for are process maps and value stream maps. These aren't going to give you the full picture, but they're going to at least give you the view of that process, so you can start to understand the environment as well. Also, as we all know, people like to relabel within companies, so just ask for risk priority matrix in the tool they use, because they might call it something else. And then the SIPOC, it's also a document that's going to have the process, and then talks about the suppliers and inputs, and then the outputs and the consumers for each of those. And that would, again, give you at least that baseline. Often the SIPOCs and the process maps are the first steps in the FMEA that they use to list the steps there. So that's talking about kind of a tool from engineering. Again, to me, that's one of the top ones that we can use. What about safety and quality? So with safety and quality, unfortunately, right, safety incidents occur and quality spills happen. I mean, it's reality. So these teams typically already have response plans in place. They, unfortunately, have either been tested from necessity, or they probably have some compliance or policy reasons that they've been tested. So again, looking at reviewing those and adding and seeing if you can modify them to include the cyber security piece, as opposed to introducing a whole new process. I would definitely recommend that. But at a very minimum, I would recommend reviewing these. And we call them sometimes 8Ds or PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, to see where if you can add in the security team as part of the communication plan. So again, on saving time, if there's a safety incident going on, we've shut down something over here. Instead of the SOC over here, like noticing logs aren't coming in, start asking questions as this team's trying to, work a safety thing. They're already in part of that communication plan, know that has occurred, and then, can move on. And also, I would have them look at if there is any safety and quality stuff, and there's after-action reports. Have them look back at the logs and see and rule out whether there was any cybersecurity impacts that could have affected that or caused that. So that's with safety and quality response plans. Another tool that I debated whether to put as an FMEA alternative, but I decided to put here was hazard analysis. This is very similar to FMEA, but whereas FMEAs are looking at outputs to the processes, hazard analysis, sometimes also called JHAs or job hazard analysis, they're more looking at the safety and internal, right? So how it affects and protects the employees. So these also can be used for SIS review as well. So with safety and quality, again, using hazard analysis to gain an understanding, adding security teams to existing response plans, and maybe integrating instead of building out a new one for security response plans. And then making sure that we review any after-action things to see if there's any cyber impact that might have played a role into that. So you'll see that I use quality throughout. Quality, to me, kind of is throughout the organization, kind of like eventually security will be. The next one we're going to talk about is quality and sourcing. So one of the things we definitely heard, before is, third-party risk and how, that plays a big part into cyber risk. So typically, the sourcing teams, they're going to have supplier scorecards where they're already touching base with and ranking and providing metrics to the customer or to the vendors with regards to typically delivery, quality metrics, and then cost savings. Because of course, we're always asking for, this cost savings there. So this is a good place to go in, especially if you have roll down requirements. You can add those to the purchase orders, but you can also add those metrics to the supplier scorecards so that they're part of that already. It's the same touch point with the vendor. You're not confusing them with additional requests coming from a different team. There's also vendor audits that typically the supplier quality group will do. I know being in supplier quality, you would go in, you'd review, look at the risks. Sometimes we do the FMEAs with them as well. But these are a great place, too, to go through, understand, as part of that audit, maybe add in the piece of what access to these vendors have to our systems, and do the audit there as, is this still relevant? Are these still the people that should have access? So the other piece that sourcing has, and this goes into the integrity, right, data integrity, is vendor documentation. So if you're doing a product review, you can definitely go to the engineers, but to know exactly what they purchased, the purchasing team is going to have data sheets and schematics there. So it's a good place to be able to get that information as well. So with quality and sourcing, understanding the supply chain layout by looking at those scorecards, how we're evaluating our suppliers, adding to that if there's stuff that we need to add, from the security perspective, adding those cyber metrics. And then, again, adding the security team to the response plans. That communication back, I think, would, again, hit that saving time a lot. And then tracking and auditing vendor access through supplier quality and sourcing tools. The last team I'm going to wrap up and talk about is finance. And I'll be honest with you, this is the one department I haven't worked in, but it's definitely the department I always ally with. To getting the buy-in, I include them on any of my first trainings. Like if I'm pulling out a new initiative or program, they're the first group that I train so that they understand and they can help me as a stopgap as other projects and programs are coming through, if those don't align with what my initiative is there. So definitely utilize them. And then they have some interesting insights they can provide as well. Because if we use the concept of follow the money, they can provide insight into existing assets that might be out of sight, out of mind, right? So we always talk about remote locations, what's out there. Well, they of course know what was purchased, and what should be out there. Typically, they'll have the teams go through and do an inventory audit every year. So they probably have that list, that they're making people check. Only caveat there is, if it's an older subsystem, it might have depreciated, so it might fall off that list, but at least you'll get a good start there. They'll also be able to tell you, what's on the shelf, like what have we bought but not implemented yet, what's coming your way. And then also, just things that are forgotten about. Maybe they never got implemented. So they'll be able to tell you upcoming changes and get what they've approved, what's coming your way, how you can start preparing for that. And again, if they don't align with some of the initiatives you're having, you can kind of utilize them as a stopgap as well. And then another area, following the money, is looking at where we paid for calibrations and high-value maintenance, right? If we're paying for calibration on a piece of equipment, that pretty much means that the settings in that equipment are pretty critical to the business. So definitely an area of risk, right, for any setting manipulation. And then high-value maintenance. That if we're paying high-value maintenance, that's a piece of equipment that you can't just easily replace. So that's something that we're going to need to look at and protect because obviously, it's costing a lot to maintain. So those are two areas that, they can give you insights on that you might not, thought of or, had before. So with finance, what can we, utilize them for? Again, getting insights on less valuable based assets based on what was purchased and following the money. Also, another thing I look for when I'm looking at that finance team and who to ally with and build that relationship with, I always look for the person that typically looks like they work in IT, multiple monitors, multiple devices on their desk. And these are great also because those are the people that are probably testing out any changes to the business systems, making sure they don't impact, because we have to close the end of every month. But also, they're great to use those in pilot groups, for your EDR program, for any beta testing, or if you're doing patching and you want to test that out as well. The other thing they can do is they typically know what other people, roles, and systems have duplicate, that they've approved for duplicate assets, right? So again, being able to understand what other teams, like if there's a key engineer that had, they've approved 3 laptops because, they need to make sure they do these. Using that second device, again, in pilot groups for EDR or those type of things, you can get a good input on that of where those duplicate assets are. Changes, we talked about that. The other person I'd like to make sure I know and I'm allied with is whoever's approving the capital expenditures requests or any project requests as well. And again, aligning with them, but also getting to understand. So if you come across an old device, right, most likely the request has been submitted at some point to get that updated or changed. And there's usually an ROI, right, that's involved in why it hasn't been, or some kind of cost disparity. So getting that insight and that understanding as to why that change is and what it would take to make that change get in place. So that they'll be able to give you that. And then ROI, again, associated with changes. The other piece there is if you have a component, right, you can get this from both finance and sourcing, but a component that has a vulnerability on it, and you're all excited because you're like, yes, this is coming, becoming unavailable. We're probably going to switch this out soon. There is a thing called last time buy. And typically, the ROI to do the re-engineering, retesting, and all that type of stuff to be able to put the new component in place isn't really cost effective. So typically a last time buy, and I've seen it happen many times, purchasing will go buy as many as they can, which could last 5 years. So whereas you from the security team are thinking, this component's about to be switched out, it's gonna fall off our list, just realize that probably isn't the case and there's a reason for it, so they'll be able to provide that reason. And in that case, you have to go look at that alternate solution. And then, as I mentioned, buy-in, including in trainings and discussion for buy-in on initiatives and alignment of projects to support those. So in summary, these are kind of the documents that I've suggested that we look at. I do recommend, obviously these help us and get a good understanding more quickly, right? But at the same time, they would let any malicious actor also get an understanding. So, please make sure that these are included. We have role-based access controls, file sharing controls, and they're probably included on your DLP or data loss program as well. just pulling it all together, as I mentioned, looking at the ROI, maybe that would change something, realizing that, cyber budgets and operation budgets there's a big disparity there. So maybe that change hasn't been approved, right, with the operations budget. But going back through, and as I mentioned, speaking the same language in regards to risk by adding the causes of cybersecurity into the FMEA, raising that up, and then now bringing the backing, and the budget of the security department to that, evaluate that change, that might actually make a difference and be able to help the operations team, and again, another way to align and build that relationship. So I talked way too fast during that, but are there any questions? Because I went quick, and that means you guys got to save time and we'll get a break. Sure, you can go to either of the microphones here. Yep.
Thanks very much for the presentation, and I think it's awesome to highlight how other teams can help be allies. There's some movement with the Security Exchange Commission right now in having more kind of dollar-based risk assessments in security. And I really like that, like Richard Searson's books on like how to measure anything in risk that kind of gets to the economic part of it. For finance teams, have you seen them be more comfortable to like help engage to look at impact in the context of, like, I loved your calibration example, for example, but like an hour of loss on this equipment would mean X. Are you seeing that more right now?
So again, I've typically gone through and just made sure I understand how they're calculating, what those changes and how, what the ROI is, right? What they're looking at. The other thing the finance team will do, usually have some interaction with the insurance side of things, right? So they've already had to kind of explain that. So I do find, like, if you find the person that can explain, like how those are calculated, so that you can, then go back and say, okay, and present those numbers to them, then I definitely do see more collaboration and willingness there. Did that answer your question? Thanks. Go ahead, Maggie.
Yeah, thank you, and great talk. Thank you for giving it. One of the things that I really appreciated seeing you speak on is the FMEA component to all this. I know as a vendor, it's a conversation that we end up having to have sometimes, where a researcher will come and say, hey, we found this in your product, and therefore I could cause X, Y, Z to happen. And it's really an interesting dynamic to have to go back to the safety team and say, hey, can you pull the FMEAs for this? And how do you see us best maybe raising awareness about that dynamic in the community? I mean, it would be my dream to have researchers come to us and say, hey, we think we found this, can you pull your FMEA and see if, this would have been accounted?
So I definitely think, again, these are things security teams can ask for, but these are also things that, on the other side, right, we can realize that they don't have the access to, so provide those. I know when we would do FMEAs, I always provided them to our preventive maintenance team, and they would build the PM programs on that. I'd provide them to our technical, writers. They'd build the manuals based on that. So just disseminating that information to those teams so that they can start, having that awareness. And then maybe not, and that's kind of the point, right? Instead of them coming to you with, hey, we have, this is smoking. We always joke, right? Oh, you let the smoke out. It's not, it's an acceptable failure mode, right? We've already evaluated that. The other piece I didn't mention was some of the safety testing, that's out there. I was trying to keep it to the things that people could easily absorb, but safety testing, we do extensive testing, right? Like if it's smoking, that's acceptable. Like if it catches fire, right? So I think just providing, that the overall for the FMEA gives them acceptable failure modes as well, and the things that we've done to mitigate. Does that answer your question?
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Very good. Well, thank you all. I appreciate it.